Hey, thank you very much. Hello everyone. Thanks for sticking around. My name is Rachel Weil. I'm actually in from Austin, Texas. I want to talk today about a project I did, which was it's this lovely thing sitting right here. I built a Wi-Fi modem for my NES, and then I built a Twitter client to display a live streaming Twitter feed. So you guys can actually test this out if you send a tweet with a hashtag #ConnectedNES. Or hashtag Radical Networks, I think also works. You will actually see your tweet on this TV right here. And no special characters, no image support, so just keep that in mind. Keep it clean, kids. So I want to talk a little bit today about this project and how it came to be, but I also want to kind of place it in the context of sort of broader artistic practices, just me personally, and then kind of putting this in the context of some things I'm interested in, like nostalgia, retro aesthetic, and history making, and also sort of feminist practice. So I'm going to get to that in just a moment. A little bit about me. My day job is that I do open source stuff at Microsoft. Yes, that's a thing. But my kind of, the thing that sort of informs my work is my background in design and in video game history. So I have an MFA from UT Austin in design, and there I kind of studied the aesthetics of 8-bit art and glitch and retro gaming and things like that, and kind of how these things, what does retro aesthetic mean? What does it do for us? Why do we employ it? Does it give us these warm, fuzzy feelings? Is there something else? And how does nostalgia sort of interact with and sometimes interfere with history? And this is a phenomenon that's not limited to video games. I kind of use video games as a case study, but I think it's super applicable to film and other kinds of media as well. So I'm also really deeply interested in video game history, as I mentioned before, especially marginalized histories. Things like the 1990s girls' game movement, which was a really historically significant thing in video game history, but not that many people know about it exactly. So one thing that I kind of argue in my work is that the prevalence of retro game aesthetics and sort of old school style and things like that, combined with the fact that companies like Nintendo and Sega are still around and they're actually deeply involved in their own sort of corporate history making, means that our memories and our history and our nostalgia and the nostalgia goods industry gets kind of all mixed together. And it becomes difficult for us to actually distinguish between manufactured histories and false histories and true histories and our real memories, right? We get goods like these, Mario energy drinks and stuff like that. And this is actually the, Nintendo and Sega are presenting us back with a history that we remember, and it might be slightly different than the way we remember them if we thought about it a little bit, right? So I think this phenomenon is really, really interesting. And it might sound a little cynical or dramatic to say that, like, oh, none of us even knows what video game history is, right? But I think there's also kind of a really interesting opportunity there for artists and hackers and people like you in the audience, because it gives us this really incredible opportunity to play with and actually rewrite history, right? Because if nobody can distinguish between real history and fake history, like, why not take advantage of that in sort of a playful, artistic way? Maybe not to necessarily deceive people, but to play with people's memories and to tap into this nostalgia, not to do the things we've already done in the past, but to talk about the things we want to do, or the things we wish had happened in the past, or the way we think the future can be. Because, when we see the past, we should be thinking, oh, this is definitely going to happen again, right? And so taking the time to sort of analyze what has happened in the past, what does old school video game aesthetic mean, I think is really interesting. To just assume that it's about happy, feel-good memories, I think is a mistake. And so I really center my work on sort of old school technologies, but in a way that questions reality and hopes to bring into focus some real but marginalized histories in gaming. So I want to talk a little bit, before I talk about this project in particular, I wanted to just give a little backstory on the history of connectivity and video game consoles. So of course, we've had connected video games for a while, and especially with PC games. So even back in the 70s, things like Maze War, we had connected PC games very, very early on, before people had PCs in their homes, right? So computers that were in research institutions and universities, places like that. A lot of students made games, and a lot of those games were networked way back in the early days. So those are things I'm not really going to talk about. What I'd like to kind of focus on is the history of early game console connectivity. So the really brief primer here is that in the 1970s, we start to get our first home game consoles. So a lot of people think of things like the home Pong sets or Magnavox Odyssey. Those are the first kind of game systems you can take home, plug into a television and play. And some people would say they're not technically game consoles because they don't have interchangeable cartridges, but those consoles with interchangeable cartridges, meaning basically consoles that had a microprocessor in them that could read different ROM data for different games, actually start to emerge just a couple years later. So we have things like the Fairchild Channel F, which is sort of the first game console to have a microprocessor and to have interchangeable cartridges where the game was actually on the cartridge, right? So Magnavox Odyssey, fun fact, had cartridges, but there was no data on them. It was basically a giant mechanical switch that said, oh, play this other game. All the games were on board. So you weren't actually, there was nothing on that cartridge except sort of a key to unlock that specific game, so kind of interesting. And of course, then things like Atari 2600 came around soon after that, and that was one of the first big sort of popular game consoles that wasn't a computer. It was really a dedicated home console. So 1980s is when we see these consoles first getting sort of connectivity hardware. And we'll talk about some examples of those in a moment. But actually pretty soon after, we start to see these microprocessor based systems, we start to see accompanying hardware to actually get these consoles online. Now, the catch here is that this entire decade, like 1980s up until the mid-1990s, that was not online play. So that was not person-to-person play. That was basically connecting to download new content or to access content, and in some cases interact with that content. But it was not like you were playing Pong with somebody in another part of the world, right? This was sort of a distribution channel for content up until really the mid-1990s. And that's really in the Sega Genesis Super Nintendo era where we start to see the first person-to-person or sort of like head-to-head connectivity in game consoles. Here on my left, your right, is an advertisement for the Magnavox Odyssey, which I love looking at old game console ads, and if you have time, sometime, like in your downtime or maybe while you're listening to me talk, check out some of these old ads, because I think what's so fascinating about them is that there was no sort of language for what a video game console was supposed to be. And really, something like the Odyssey was drawing somewhat from the arcade experience, but even that hadn't really exploded yet. So they actually draw a lot from like board games. And so Magnavox Odyssey came with like paper money and like dice and pieces, physical pieces, because they're like, I don't know, it's a game. Like, I don't know what this is for, but maybe, right? And so it's really fascinating to see like those things we would really never see in a game console today. This also had overlays that you stuck to the television because this console didn't display color graphics. And so they had to get kind of creative. Basically, every game was 3 squares. Football, 3 squares. Spelling, 3 squares. Every game was like some variation of how these 3 squares moved around on the screen. So very primitive, but also very creative. So the first real connectivity hardware for a game console was probably the play cable for Intellivision in 1981. And so this was actually based kind of around the cable TV model. You would subscribe, and maybe every month or so you were meant to get a new game. Here is a screenshot of what it looks like when you're logged into Play Cable. Copyright date 1971, but I think it was actually released in, or 1979. It was released in 81. That's kind of typical if something has a long development cycle. After that was GameLine for Atari 2600 in 1983. I read that GameLine, the company, like later turned into AOL. Like that company kind of pivoted after the Atari connectivity system didn't work out. But the people who came up with the GameLine were like, oh, we could send data over the phone line, and they had this whole like cool protocol for doing that. When this didn't pan out with the Atari 2600, for a lot of reasons, we can talk about those in a minute, they actually shifted that business to AOL, which is kind of cool. There was also the Famicom Net system. So Famicom was the Japanese version of the NES, which is the console we see here. And they did have a modem, like a sort of a modem adapter for that console. It was mostly used for horse betting and stock checking and things like that. And actually the horse betting was fairly popular because at this time there weren't that many folks with PCs in their, like, internet-connected PCs in their homes. And so, like, in one sense, it wasn't a terribly popular device, but on the other hand, it had like 30% of the online horse betting market because there were so few other ways to do that. So it's kind of interesting. And then finally, we have a couple of interesting things like Minnesota State Lottery modem. So the idea was to actually take this Famicom modem in a way, sort of, bring it to the NES. And it was specifically for gambling in the state of Minnesota. So the idea was they had actually created a controller with a number pad on it, and you could play the lottery through the NES online. It turns out people thought that might be a bad idea because kids and gambling, and there might be some mixed messages there. So that wasn't actually ever released. There are some photos of that. There are some, there's a VHS tape that was like sort of pitching that product. So you can see the sort of prototype of that. But pretty interesting, and that would have been 1991. And then finally the teleplay, which is a super interesting attempt to not only put the NES online, but have it do online play with either other NES owners or other Sega Genesis owners. So there was actually this idea that there could be games that you could play either on an NES or a Genesis, and you could play with folks online, even if it was on a different console. This modem was being developed by Nolan Bushnell, who you might know of Atari fame. His idea was like, let's just make it, and we'll pitch it to Nintendo and Sega, and they'll be so bowled over that they'll license it, and that didn't happen, because actually Nintendo and Sega were bitter rivals, and they didn't really like the idea of this piece of hardware that would sort of suggest you could play the competitor's product. So pretty interesting history. Again, some of these things kind of going on the side of vaporware, sort of undeveloped or half-done ideas. Apparently the teleplay, they also made a couple games to demonstrate the online play capabilities, and I believe those have never been actually found, but it's believed they might be out there somewhere. I love this screenshot. This is a prototype for Online Go for the Famicom. As I mentioned before, the Famicom modem was mostly for like the sort of horse betting and stock market checking and things like that. They actually did want to do online play as well, but they prototyped it and it wasn't working the way they wanted it to, so they pulled those games. But apparently they had also, Nintendo had developed 5 or 6 games meant to do online play, I think mostly for like turn-based games like Go. So what I love about these devices and why I kind of wanted to talk about the history of them is that, you know, they kind of exist in this fringe space where they either were actual vaporware or they weren't vaporware, but like they didn't really pick up any steam, they weren't popular, and they're very undocumented or underdocumented. And so like part of me when I'm researching these things, I'm like, is this real? Did they really do a Minnesota State Lottery modem? That doesn't sound right. And it exists in this really interesting space where it's making me question video game history that I'm reading, whether that's online or in books. You know, it's great to get those like resources like advertisements or things that were handed out at CES or something because you feel like, oh, this is pretty legit. But it's actually pretty easy to fabricate that stuff too. So this stuff always has me like, ooh, I wonder if this is real or not. And that actually makes it a really interesting site for developing things like connectedness, right? Because I get to add my Wi-Fi peripheral to that list of like things that I'm not really sure if this could have come out in 1987. I think, there are a lot of reasons why these networks and hardware peripherals are really hard to know a lot about, why there's little known about them. If you think about the difficulties of let's say, internet archival, for example, and then add to that you have this really custom hardware and a modem that is made specifically for one computer and special protocols. And also, there are companies that are still around today that are protecting their IP. And also, the fact that these games were kind of ephemeral was part of the way they were planning to sell them, right? Like, you have to be on the network to get this game. That was part of how they were pitching it. And so, to archive those games or save them and say like, oh, but maybe we'll like give it away later, wasn't, I think, part of their thinking process. So a lot of the difficulties of sort of internet archive practice, and then like with a couple additional factors. So again, the fact that these devices are kind of in this weird interstitial space of like true, false, real, fake, is kind of what drew me to doing a device like this. It makes it a really excellent space for telling false histories. For the past 6 years, I've been rewriting video game history to make it cuter and girlier. And I've been doing this in order to write myself into that history. For a long time, I felt like I didn't fit in as a coder or a gamer, especially in the era of the NES when I was, probably, I remember like being 5 or 6, and the NES was still kind of a contemporary console, or it was in play. And I was really into like Barbie and Hello Kitty and My Little Pony and stuff like that. And I don't know, like no one, it wasn't like I couldn't have played these games if I really, really pushed. But I did get a little bit of pushback of like, oh, you don't really belong here. Like, you really shouldn't be playing video games, or you shouldn't be using a computer, you shouldn't be coding, and things like that. And so I wasted a whole bunch of time just not even trying because I felt like I didn't fit in. And I think that happens all the time, not just around gender, but there are other reasons why there's some subtle reason that you're not interested in something and you don't pursue it. And then, oh, you realize like, I actually like could have given myself a big favor if I had not kind of bought into these stereotypes or kind of believed to myself. So I can't change the past, but fortunately I learned 6502 assembly and the hardware architecture of the NES, and I learned how to write server backend code. And so now I can change the past, which is kind of cool. And that's really why I built connectedness. Like what is the past really, right? Nostalgia, retro, old school, it's all a big jumble, especially because Nintendo and Sega have a vested interest in selling us backpacks with Mario and Sonic on them. So I'm going to talk briefly about what connectedness is exactly. It is an open source hack that allows you to wirelessly stream data to the original console. So this is a stock console, not modified in any way. It kind of consists of 3 main components, which are a custom cloud-hosted server backend, a wireless modem, and I'm sorry, I know there's like half of you that are like, it's not a modem, stop saying it's a modem. I know it's not a modem, but it's part of that like, fake history thing, right? We'll talk a bit about more what it is. It is a microcontroller that's connected to the cloud, that's it. It's not a modem, but I think not using that word would make it really, really confusing for people who don't know what it is, right? It's a really simple way to talk about this device. And I do want it to live in that space of like, oh, cool, hardware peripheral for the NES. And modem feels like the right word for that. So finally, the third piece of this is an NES game cartridge with the custom ROM. So really, this NES is, well, not this NES, but most NES, it'll run on a regular NES, but I do have a custom cartridge in here with kind of a custom game that I've written in order to be able to accept this Twitter data that's being piped in. The whole thing's on GitHub, so you could actually, if you want, it's all open source, you can check it out, clone the repo, build one yourself. This is the repository. So let's talk a little bit more about these three components. So we have the backend. This is really the first link in the chain. So who here does like Node.js development? Oh, like a couple, cool, okay. So I won't go like too far into that, but basically it's a way to write server code in JavaScript. And so this, again, what this server is doing is essentially listening to the entire stream of Twitter data that's coming in, and it's finding things that are associated with a certain hashtag, and it's pulling those tweets out. And then that JavaScript server is also parsing those strings. The NES is dumb. It can't parse strings. It doesn't know what spaces are. It doesn't know what text is. So I need to do a lot of processing up front and just send it to the NES, because I want the NES to be as dumb as possible. I don't want it to be processing anything if I can help it. So this is some of the code. Again, what I'm doing is basically breaking the strings up, getting it nice. Any sort of like emoji or things like that, I'm stripping those out and replacing with question marks. Reason for that being that the NES is really limited on RAM, and trying to do even like a portion of the emoji would completely max it out. So I decided to make a decision there. There might be some workarounds, but that's kind of what I decided for the scope of this project. So this server has to run all the time. It can't, because it has to always listen to Twitter data. So you could put this on a Pi. You could put it on your own machine. It will only be running when it's running on your machine. Having like a dedicated server would be the ideal way to do this. I have it hosted in the cloud, and that way it's kind of always running, and I don't have to think about it too hard. But there are a lot of like different cloud hosting things that you could use to have this running. Yeah, oh, look, I made bullet points that explain all those things. Yeah, so it's grabbing the Twitter data, parsing that tweet, and then here's the third part that I didn't mention, is actually publishing that string to the cloud. So what does that mean? So the device here in this modem is a particle photon. I love this this little microcontroller. It's awesome. It's basically an Arduino. It's Arduino-like. It's Arduino compatible, but it's about this big, and it has onboard Wi-Fi, and it costs like $19. So it's cheaper, smaller, and it has Wi-Fi, which is really, really amazing. They also have a really great JavaScript API for doing event handling. So if you want to send or receive data from this device, they actually host the API to do all of that. So when I have my Twitter string parsed and I'm ready to go, I can actually publish it straight to this microcontroller, and I don't really have to like write a whole bunch of code for that, because Particle, who makes this board, has done a lot of that. So essentially, the only thing that really happens on this board is I take that string and I convert it into an array of bytes. Pretty simple. And then it's doing a little bit of stuff here for the transfer. So this microcontroller is actually plugged into the second controller port. So nothing really hacky there. You can think of actually just taking a like an NES controller and cutting the controller part off and taking the wires out and kind of hooking that up to this microcontroller. So this is a picture of me desoldering the wires off of the board. So if you opened up an NES controller, this is what you'd see inside. Actually desoldering the wires off. I said you could take a controller and just cut the controller part off, but don't do that because those wires are really fine. And if you could desolder them from the board, they have nice little like solid core pins, which are way easier to work with. And if you're not good at desoldering things, that's fine, because this board isn't going to do anything without this cable anyway. So if you just want to like put your desoldering braid on there for like ever and totally fry the board, that's kind of okay, right? Because this isn't going to work without the cord anyway. So what do all these little wires do? There's basically power and ground. This is actually being powered from the NES. So you'll notice there's actually not any other cable that's plugging it into an outlet. So that's pretty cool. And then we also have a couple lines like a clock and a latch and a data that we use. Essentially what we're doing here is hijacking the controller input method and using it to send text. So you have your A, B, select, start, up, down, left, right, Konami code, right? These are the buttons on the NES controller. I actually like to refer to them as stellar bods. This is my crowning achievement in terms of coming up with anagrams. So please, soak it in. Thank you. Okay. So if you think about this, like basically, again, we're hijacking this controller mechanism. And so as far as NES is concerned, it's just getting a bunch of controller presses from the second player. What it's actually getting are hex values that correspond to ANSI, right, hex values. So if you think about things like, A8, C2, FF, these are just hex values that correspond either with button presses or, in our case, with text. And some people ask, like, well, can't you just, yes, if you plug in a controller into the second controller port and mash the buttons, it will display garbage text, because it's literally how it works. I wish I could say I was clever enough to come up with this protocol scheme, but it was actually Andy Reitano, who's in the audience here, who first prototyped this transfer protocol with Arduino over USB. It's like super, super clever, so he deserves all the credit for that. And none of this work would really exist without his previous project and friendship, frankly. So this is the first enclosure I built for the Wi-Fi modem. I decided instead of going 3D printing route, I wanted to do something more craft-oriented and cutesy to kind of match what I was going for. And when I think of my own childhood and nostalgia, I think of crafting. So I stitched this. It took a couple days, probably 3 days, to design and then actually stitch this by hand. I did the Wi-Fi symbol on there, which I really enjoyed. I really like this is plastic canvas needlepoint, which is really cool because you can build these 3D objects with it, and it doesn't require any tools. All you need is a needle and yarn. So I think it's kind of like the cool predecessor to 3D printing, and I don't know, I like using it a lot. This one here, actually, Andy and I made last night, because he has a 3D printer, a laser cutter that cuts acrylic. And so I like this kind of glowing, mystical aesthetic as well. I skipped some slides. Okay, so we talked a little bit about how this works. We talked a little bit about the server backend. And then I kind of wanted to talk about that last part, which is the cartridge here. So one of the interesting things about the NES, it doesn't have a built-in character set. So like a lot of computers, you just be like, print hello world. Well, you can't do that because it doesn't have built-in character set. So I actually drew the font by hand. And I did something kind of funny, which is instead of putting the letters in alphabetical order, I actually put them where their hex values are. So that as the hex values come through, instead of there being a lookup table, it actually just pulls it straight from the graphics, basically that graphics tile, and prints it directly to the screen. So it was kind of clever, but also if you look at the ROM, it's like the letters are all out of order, which is kind of funny. If you've never written assembly before, you're missing out. This is an example piece of code this is a portion of the code that resets the X and Y coordinates of a balloon when it reaches the top of a screen. So this isn't the code for animating the balloons. It's resetting the XY coordinates when the balloon reaches the top, and then it needs to respawn in a different place. Even this code doesn't do it all. This is a portion of that. So a lot of lines when you're talking about assembly versus something that you could probably do very, very quickly in a contemporary programming language. But it's really cool because you kind of know what's happening on the hardware level. So I really like that aspect of it. Cool, so pretty straightforward project. Of course, everything's easy when you edit out all of the mistakes and things like that. There were a lot of interesting challenges, like how do you break up JavaScript and exclude unprintable characters? You have, unlike developing for the web, should not be responsive, because we know exactly what the resolution of this is always going to be. And then some other like kind of interesting questions about like how does an NES controller work, which was pretty weird. This was mostly built like in 2 weeks in kind of a crunch because I was like, oh, I'm gonna present this at a conference, and then the conference came up. I was like, oh, I have to build it like now. So I think there's some things that could be improved, but I hope to continue working on it and actually have some plans for things I want to do with it next. One thing I kind of hope this becomes is not just like a haha funny NES Twitter client, but actually like an open source tool set for making internet connected software for old game consoles. So again, like this is all open source. If you wanted to make a different game that connects to the internet and you like feel comfortable or are ready to learn assembly, like you could do that, right? It means I need to write better documentation and have more demos, and probably it means I need to abstract away some of the assembly, because I think it's unrealistic to be like, yeah, just like learn this assembly language and you can make your own games. And I don't like barriers to entry, and I like bringing new people into these cool hobbyist areas. So I'm still thinking about the best way to do that. So that's kind of the technical background, and I'm mostly done with this sort of like how and what, but I want to kind of come back to that question of why. I mentioned before that one thing about retro gaming and computer nostalgia is that it can be distorted, either with our knowledge or without. And if we don't see and acknowledge that distortion, we're not going to really be cognizant of it. And our real memories of something might get overwritten with like Nintendo's version of those memories, right? So if you think about, for example, like 8-bit art, you probably think of something kind of like blocky and low color with a low resolution, maybe something like this or Space Invaders. And like, it's funny because, you know, games didn't look like this. Like, they weren't super blocky. If you come up and look at this CRT, like, CRTs don't render it that way, right? Like, they have the phosphors, and they're not, like, lined up. They're, like, in this sort of, like, triangle shape. And the graphics are fuzzy, and that's how they looked. And it wasn't until we started emulating them and taking these graphics and blowing them up on big computer monitors that we saw this pixel stuff. And now that's retro style, which is to me like, but that's not what it was really like. What's up with that? This is kind of an example of how our memories of something can be overwritten to the point where when I look at blocky stuff, I think NES, but that's not blocky in the same way. So how do we reconcile that? I did this photo for the cover of this really amazing book about the NES called I'm Error. If you haven't read it and you're interested in NES, it's like the technical Bible. It's really amazing. But when he asked me to do the cover image, I really didn't want to do pixel art for this very reason. And that seemed like the obvious thing. So I actually took one of the NES games that I had made and photographed it on the CRT because I was really interested in getting that like close-up of what these games really looked like, right? Not blocky, but kind of fuzzy, and I love that. So this is just like one illustration of the malleability of our memories in technology, and especially in the face of sort of contemporary media and products that keep attempting to override our impressions. The other example of this would be Street Shark syndrome. I don't know if you guys, I won't go into it, but someone basically like made a fake character in Street Sharks and then like put it in a wiki like 15 years ago, and it never got taken out. And then like everyone was like, oh yeah, remember that character? It was like never happened. And apparently like this wiki write-up with all these fake episodes got actually put into the DVD release, like the official, like it's super weird. But things like this can happen, right? And so I think artists have a really unique opportunity here. I absolutely love the Street Sharks thing. But I think artists have a really unique opportunity to jump in and say something, and that's kind of what I try to do with my work. So my personal motto is no bad memories. My website's nobadmemories.com, which is referring to this like now defunct floppy disk company, and kind of a reference to the idea that we can make new happy memories of the past, even things that didn't really happen. As makers and programmers, we really have the power to rewrite history with these old hardware hacks. Not to do it because we're going to get props on Motherboard in a slightly, I think, complimentary way, but I'm not sure. But, you know, really like to create new ambient senses of being and belonging that invite participation from broader groups of people. If we're gonna like take the time to make these ridiculous hardware hacks and to reverse engineer protocols and learn assembly, why not use that as an opportunity to reflect on our history and to incorporate more diverse influences and experiences? Like, I don't want to keep making Mega Man over and over, right? So the point of hacks like this is like not the half-baked rumination of like, oh, old video games are cool, but like let's use this and talk about our dreams and our hopes for the future and where we think the past could have been better and what we're going to do when this past inevitably comes back and happens again. So that's it. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take a couple questions.
Any questions for Rachel? Yep.
Thank you, that was really cool. I have one question. What would be your feeling of sort of like using the NES as sort of like a dumb terminal, so that sort of like instead of programming in a sort of like assembly, sort of like just using it in a way as an output device?
Yeah, so using the NES as a dumb terminal. I think you still have the issue of like the fact that the NES doesn't have a built-in character set. So at some level, like you do have to you have to at least create that interface, and maybe just once. But because you couldn't really send it just like text data, like the graphics are all kind of sent to the NES. There's nothing that comes standard with it. So I think if you created, let's say, a cartridge that could handle that processing, and that's essentially what this Twitter thing does. It just handles the text display, and it does the balloons and all that goofy stuff too. But then, yeah, you could certainly modify this, and it wouldn't really take that much modification to turn this ROM into something like that.
But if you could do it, would you? Or is it for you something sort of like different?
I see. So would I personally be interested in it? I think if I did that, it would be like making a really cutesy, girly terminal. Again, it's that idea of like writing myself into the history that's really important to me. Like in a way, I'm not tech fetishist in the same way that a lot of people are, because I didn't grow up with this stuff and I didn't have access to it. And me, I'm like kind of, in a way, reliving a childhood that I didn't have. And so if I were doing something like Terminal, which I didn't have a computer like that when I was a kid, but I would probably make it like really like, instead of the carrot, it's like a heart or something, right? And like maybe it's like pink or something like that. So I think that would be my approach to that kind of project, rather than just like, can I do it, but like, why do it, or what's the thought process?
Okay, another one.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the process of creating the custom game cartridge and sort of what hardware is required to burn your program onto it?
Sure. So the question was about like how do you make an NES game? So typically, like I just write assembly code in like a glorified text editor, like something like Sublime or Atom or VS Code or something like that. It's not really a full IDE or anything like that. Like to know how to write this code, there's a lot of work that goes into understanding the technical requirements and the hardware specifications, and like, okay, well, like where's video RAM and stuff like that. So there's a lot of research that goes into it, but the tools are pretty simple. Once you have that code, all the tools that are used in creating NES games today are community built, because Nintendo did not release developer tools for this console. So there are things like compilers and graphics editors and things like that that do help tremendously with the development of the software. But again, like I don't know if that's how these games were made originally. Probably something similar. Once I have my code and I've used these graphics tools to help me draw the pixel art and things like that, I can compile it. I could split that compiled file into two parts and burn the program code on one EEPROM and burn the graphics code on another EEPROM and solder it to a board. I could use a donor board or one that's been created from scratch. Often what I use is a development tool that's basically an NES cartridge with a memory card slot. And that's really helpful for development time, because I don't want to be soldering like 50 pins every time I need to test a build and it doesn't work or whatever. You can also run these games in emulators, so they do work. This doesn't really work in an emulator because of the hardware requirement, but you can test these games in emulators as well, and that helps with the development process.
Thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Okay.
Hi, how important is for you in this reformation and reconstruction of nostalgia and history, the role of hardware? And so for example, something like this could be, as you said, on an emulator or like virtual console or something like that. So how much do you think the role of hardware is important in that process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the role of hardware for me is really important, but maybe for a different reason than other people working in similar fields. For me, the reason this hardware is so important is primarily because it lends authenticity. If I made something in an emulator, I think people don't really understand, like, oh, it's running on a computer or something. But to be able to physically plug this into the hardware and see it running in this way gives it a level of authenticity that I think emulation doesn't, or working with something like, let's say, Pico 8, which is low res and 8-bit style, but it's not like old hardware, right? So really, because I'm talking about history and trying to rewrite the past, I think like that hardware aspect of it is really important for me for like authenticity. And some other things I do are like, sometimes I've made like manuals or flyers or things like that, and I try to emulate the way that those looked, which often the graphic design was quite poor. And so I try to emulate that. And when I was in grad school, my professors would be like, I think you need to choose a different typeface. And I think you need to think about your line spacing more. And I'd be like, but, and then I would pull out my like, this is what it actually looked like though. So I try not to polish too much or make it too much better than what we might have seen in that era. But, obviously I take some liberties as well.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay.
Have you thought about putting in some air pressure sensor onto your modem so that it wouldn't boot so many times and then you would blow into it and...
Ha ha. I get it. That's pretty funny, actually. You could, because you've got access to all the same pins pretty much as an Arduino, so like, yes, you definitely could, and that would be kind of funny. I like it, maybe version 0.3. Or you can build one and tell me how it goes. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Hey, I was wondering if like the NES had like an expansion port or anything other than the controller ports, and like if there was a reason you didn't want to use those and you wanted to use the controllers instead.
Yes, so the NES does have an expansion port. It's in the bottom. It's not normally accessible, and nothing ever used it. So I did think about that. Not too much is known about the protocol, and probably if I did some research and testing, I could figure it out. I already knew how to use a controller port, and I thought that this would be kind of the easiest way for other people to interface with it, because it's something you just plug in. Whereas the expansion port and like having to create custom, there's not, what do you plug into it? Like you'd have to, I don't know, probably manufacture some plastic and manufacture different board sizes. So the fact that you could just take kind of existing hardware and modify it quite easily, I think is a benefit for this. You do lose the second controller port, so there are trade-offs, right? And I think it would be interesting to explore, like, I don't know whether the expansion port would be like significantly faster if it has other benefits. Again, like it wasn't something I did a ton of research on just because I think one, like Andy's prototype had used a controller port, and I was like, oh, that's so clever. And it really took advantage of the hardware that is already out there. So I didn't really investigate. I didn't go too far down the expansion port route. Yeah.
Okay.
I was a huge fan of Game Genie, and other people might remember Game Genie. You would plug your cartridge into that little, I don't know what you call that, and then you plug it in. and it would let you could do things like get 1,000,000 lives, right? So it let you do lots of cheats, but also do things like change the colors of things, or start you on a different level, or make you, make everything underwater, things like that. Is that something that you've explored or interested in using as a tool of artistic or creative expression? I'm kind of asking that because that was one of the few things that actually felt like kind of hackerish about using an NES in that age,
Yeah.
and was quite strange, I thought, in many ways.
Yeah, no, I haven't. Like in terms of a cartridge pass-through, that's not something I've thought about, but it's a pretty cool idea. It might be worth actually talking to Andy during the break, because he did a project that's kind of similar to this, where he's created this like intermediary level that you can access via a phone to like mess with RAM values live. And so it's the same idea of Game Genie, where it's like overwriting those RAM values, but instead of having that physical hardware, it's something that you can do like massively multiplayer even from the phone. So like that's a really cool example of someone who has done something like that. I think again for me, like when I'm thinking about projects like this, my viewpoint of like, how does this write me back into history is always the first thing I think about. And so like, I think there are a million cool things you could do with the NES, and I love seeing what everyone does with it. I think for me personally, the way I prioritize it is like, I feel like I didn't feel like I was part of this culture, and I wasn't in on it when it happened. And so I really like think about my childhood and the things that like, what would have made me interested in the NES as a kid? What would make it interesting to me now? And I find like a lot of women that I've talked to actually have like they came back to old consoles later on as adults and kind of rediscovered them because like maybe their brother didn't let them play, or like whatever sort of backstory or reason, or they just didn't have one growing up. And so I find those things like really interesting. Like you have this different perspective where you're sort of like reclaiming something and experiencing it for the first time. And so like that's really the thought that comes to me first before I kind of explore how or the sort of what and how is really the why, and like why it's particularly interesting to me and interesting in terms of my interest in history and nostalgia, and especially these marginalized histories and like the things we don't really know about, like girls' video game playing habits in the 80s and 90s, for example. But yeah, it's a really cool idea, for sure.
Hi, my question is also honing in on the why part again. I suppose I'm really interested in what you consider to be your voice as opposed to the corporate voices that are changing our nostalgia. So I was wondering if you could expand on what you think they're doing. And secondly, about the sort of the retrofitting of quality in a way. So you have swapped different, say graphics and hardware into a more feminine version, but you're very clear about keeping that sort of low quality into it. So do you think memory degradation is an integral part of memory, and that's something you're fighting against, and you think the polishing off is a part of the, anyway, yeah, please.
Yeah, no, I do think the polish, we definitely see a lot of retro goods that are very polished and very beautiful and vector and all of that. And I like those things, and I think they have a place. And it's like, oh, the past, but better. And I think that's cool and valuable, but I think we run the risk also of like replacing that and all of the things attached, like all the political attachments of something, and shaking off like all the meaning and just saying like, oh, it's just an aesthetic. Like, no, it's not just an aesthetic. It came out of a specific time. It's related to certain things that were happening, like politically, socially, and to shake those things off and say like, oh, that doesn't matter, I think is sort of a little bit like irresponsible. Maybe that's too strong of a word. But when I was teaching video game history at the university, like I always had my students think about this, like you cannot just take a style and like, right, like blow like you're blowing into the cartridge. You can't just blow off all of the sort of like political meaning. And so I think the polish sometimes can do that. And so I do stay away from that. In terms of the question about like the corporate nature of it, that's something that I actually try to intentionally play on. Like I want my stuff to look kind of corporate. Like in a lot of ways, I don't want it to look too indie, because I think a lot of the gender stereotype stuff that comes out of old gaming has to do with the fact that these consoles were marketed as toys for a long time, and so that's part of the reason why the marketing was so stereotyped. It came out of the toy industry, and that's something we don't really think about that much today. So I like going back to that corporate-y feeling of like, yeah, we're like a toy company, and we made this thing for like girls, I guess. That to me is really interesting, and so like maybe this doesn't look that corporate-y because it's kind of mystical and weird, but I like to kind of play with that too and not be too kind of arty with it, because I think the corporate origins of game history are actually something I want to highlight, saying like, hey, these used to be toys and they were marketed like toys, and let's think about that and talk about that.
Anyone else? Okay, thank you so much, Rachel.
Thank you.